Going to be opened. It's really an exciting time. I actually remember when the 1910 census was revealed, and I went to Boston, Massachusetts. Well, it wasn't actually in Boston, it was outside of Boston to look at the census records. And I saw my grandparents, and it was pretty exciting. How many of you are in the 1950 census? Yeah, I'm barely not in it, so. But it's kind of exciting because people I know are in it, and that's kind of makes it exciting. I think the 1940 census was that way also for me. But so I think all of that is always exciting when you know the people who are in it. Okay, sorry. So I really found this interesting. Here were some advertisements for the 1950 census, message of them. And also, you know, it's for a better future for your children. We'll know about population so we can have more schools or whatever it might be. But I just thought it was really interesting. You know, let's make him count in America's future. And they had a lot of children on the advertisements. So the main point was to try to strive for accuracy. And I do think the census strives for that. I think any of us who have done research in census records know that they're not really the most accurate records, but, you know, and to tell the truth. Tell the truth because we're going to protect your privacy. So I think those are important points to make. I thought they were interesting with the advertisements. So where can you find the 1950 census? Where have you found the 1950 census? Where do you go to find it, to search it? There are a number of places. I just listed a few. You haven't. How many of you have looked in the 1950 census?
I've looked at it, but I don't recall where I found it.
Could have been Ancestry. Could have been the archives. Ancestry. Carol Lee, where did you go? Ancestry. So I've looked in Ancestry and Family Search both. And if you don't find your relative in one, try a different site to see if that might help you. And you might want to look for the enumeration districts. And there are some resources. If you go to the archives, there are resources and a place to search. And the resources are kind of interesting. I was reading through some of the directions for the enumerators. It was kind of interesting things that I found out there. But just try different sites, and I think that's true for any census record you're looking at. Try different search engines to see if that might help you find someone. I did once, I was looking for a great-grandfather in Boston, Massachusetts. My ancestors were from New England. Boston, Massachusetts, in the 1900 census. And I could not find him. His name was Cornelius Kelleher. And I just couldn't find him, and I thought, okay, I know he's there. I went page by page trying to find him in a particular area, and I found him, and his name was all messed up spelling-wise. I don't think at that time the enumerators asked how to spell names. I just think they wrote whatever came to their mind. And my great-grandfather couldn't read or write, so he probably didn't help much either.
Yeah,
So.
you
know, at that point in 1900. So, but I did find him by going through page by page, knowing more or less where he lived. Okay, I had to have this picture. I love this picture. This is my mom, my grandmother, and her sisters, and a cousin. This is a cousin. I love this picture because it captures their personalities to me. And I don't know if it was in 1950, but I just love that. I'm sure it wasn't, it was later. But so who do I know in the census? I know my grandparents are there, my aunts and uncles. I have cousins in the census. I'm not there, nor my siblings, but we'll be in the next one. So in 9 years, we'll get to see ourselves in it. Great aunts and uncles that were living are still in that census. And so it was kind of fun to go through and see who was there and what information we could find. My mother was 19. It was just, she got married in January, so the census was in April. Whoops. And she was there just before, a few months really before she got married. So it was kind of fun, her and my dad in their respective homes. So I looked up different family members, and I really would recommend that you do this. Who is in the census that you know? Look them up and see what you find. Some of it will be confirmed information you know. Oh yeah, I know they live there. Or some of it may be a little bit surprising. Or it might give you information that you didn't know you might find out. My grandmother, who was a single parent at the time, earned for the year in 1949. That was one of the questions. What did you earn last year? And she said $2,000. My mother was 19. She's listed as a file clerk for a retail store. And I know that she worked at Sears. Uncle David had lived in New Hampshire, but here he is in New Hampshire, and all of his kids are listed, and he was listed as a specific engineer. And that's one thing you're going to find on the census. They really tried hard not to just say that they were a salesperson, but what kind of salesperson they were. They didn't just say he was an engineer. To have more information about him, and he didn't say how much he earned. And I found someone later, a second cousin, that was listed as a vice president of a company, and it says confidential, and he wouldn't answer the question because it was confidential. So, I guess if you made more money, my grandmother didn't make as much, she didn't care. But, if they were executives or maybe higher ranking, they really didn't want to reveal how much they made. I don't know. Those are only two examples, not statistically significant. My mother-in-law, who still lives, was shown as a girl in 8th grade. It's kind of cool. My aunt was listed with her husband and all of her children, and I know my cousins. I know my aunt and uncle. I couldn't find one of my aunts. Now, she would have been married then, but I just couldn't find her, so that's something I'm going to have to look for. I know she lived in Texas for a while, but I really would like to find her with her ex-husband. She was divorced long before I met her, and I would kind of like to find that and see where exactly she was. My grandparents were home, and my aunts and uncles that I know were with them. And there was a cousin there that I don't really know. That was kind of interesting. I know the last name, but I've never heard of that person. So that gives me an opportunity to look more into her. And it's a family name that I know there's a family in the New England area. Well, O'Brien. Unfortunately, I'm Irish, and all of my ancestors from Ireland are Sullivan, Murphy, O'Brien, Kelleher, but the rest are pretty common. And so it's an O'Brien, but it's kind of pricked my conscience, thinking, who is this person? I'm going to find her. So I would suggest that you do that. Start with people you know, because I don't know about you, but the current generation for me is the one I think is going to be the hardest. How many cousins and things do you have that are married? And especially the next census. You know, each census, I think, prepares you for the next one. You know, the 1940, it said, were you here 5 years ago? Yes or no? That kind of helps you determine where they were for a while. Because for me, a lot of the censuses before that, they were moving around. Every census, they were in a different house. And I think they started to become more settled as time went on. Why do you think, what do you think is unique about the 1950 census or the 1950 era? What do you think would be unique then? It's after World War II. What do you think might be unique about it?
Well, those are the booming days.
Yes.
They were the booming days, the 50s.
Yes.
And part of the 60s were the booming years.
Exactly. And so the population just exploded during that time.
Well, look at all the new houses, the GI Bill. They came from the war and they had the GI Bill.
There was a really big housing evaluation or survey on the back of each of the pages. Unfortunately, that was not microfilmed, and so it's lost, unfortunately. But they really went to a lot of, they probably have the statistics from it, but they don't have the actual returns anymore of what was included on that, unfortunately, because that would have been great to look at. So I thought it was interesting, and I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read some of it. Someone was an agent wasn't satisfactory on the thing. They had to say they were a freight agent, an insurance agent, a sales agent, specifically what kind of agent. Clerk, like for my mom. Just saying she was a clerk wasn't enough. They had to wanted specifics on those things. Mechanic, nurse, not just a registered nurse, but maybe a nursemaid, a practical nurse. Teachers, what subject are you teaching as a teacher? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit more detail on those kinds of things. I was a little surprised that there weren't more questions. I mean, on the supplementary questions for just a few of the people, there was like, do you have a TV? Are you a veteran? Were you in World War I, World War II, or other? Mm-hmm. But not for everyone, which is too bad. I don't know. I was surprised that there were more details on that.
My father was an engineer, and his return in 1950, he was a civil engineer, but specifically, he was a sanitary engineer, and he was in the first class from the U of I, who graduated with a degree in sanitary engineering. So the 1950 census civil sanitary engineer.
Yeah, so see how specific that was, even though it was a civil engineer, but specifically to say sanitary.
And a lot of the firemen worked with the railroad here in Clinton.
Yes.
There were a lot of them.
My husband's grandfather and they died before she was born.
Mm-hmm.
She had 2 siblings that died when they were young, and I don't think she knew them. And I found them because of the address that you get on a census, and you know, like I say, their names are Murphy. So when I see a James Murphy and an Annie O'Brien, I'm like, okay, that could be one of 100 in Boston. But because of the address, I knew it was her family. And I was like, wow. And then I found a cemetery record that had them buried there also. So, you know, any clue you can find. Even occupation is important. So also they talked about school, which this is kind of new, I think. So they would just say school, first year, second, third, up to 8 or 9, and 12, and then they finish that year, right after it, yes or no. So, I really think it would be good to just take the 1950 census, look for your people you know. Because you already know something about them. You know kind of where they grew up. You may have known that their parents lived in this area, that certain parents were born or something like that. Or maybe your parent wasn't chosen, but their sibling was, and they may ask about the TV, which is in the home of everybody. So look at relatives that way too, to see what information you can glean from it. It's interesting because they're like every 5 or 6 people. A lot of times someone in the family is chosen for those extra questions. Check the addresses with addresses you know. Are they living where you expect them to live? Like I said, with my aunt, I could not find her, and I'm thinking, is she in Texas during this time? Where I know she lived somewhere else, but you know, where was she during that time? So, finding the addresses. What kind of schooling? Did they finish school? Maybe not. You know, a lot of people didn't finish school. My dad didn't graduate from high school. He took the GED after he got out of the service. And again, what are some of the occupation, and is it the job that he had later that you knew him by? Maybe it was a different job early on. But I think all of those things lead to different research, hopefully. Now, I always say to someone when they're trying to find someone, now, and you can imagine with my group of ancestors, this is especially true. How do I know this James Murphy is my James Murphy out of the hundreds that probably lived in Boston when he lived there? How do I know it's him? The name, the place. I have found that most of my ancestors in Boston, if it shows them living in the suburbs, it's not them. They lived in the city. They were immigrants, they lived in the city. An approximate year, you know that. We kind of guess. The census gives us clues to that. You know, how old were they in the census? You kind of can guess when they were born. It's not exact. Like I said, there are mistakes, but it gives you an approximate time to look. And the biggest one is a relationship. This is why I love census records, because you have a whole family of relationships. That helps you to know that's your family. You know he had a brother by that name. You know he had a sister. Maybe you didn't know everybody, but there that are the same. It's probably your person. It's your ancestor. And so, like I say, by knowing the address, knowing when they were certain places, that helps you find others. I had a distant cousin, put her and her siblings, she was the youngest at the time. Her mother died giving birth, and the child ended up dying a few months later. So she was the youngest. They were kind of put in a home. In looking at historical documents for that home, I know sometimes poor people would leave their children there, kind of while they were trying to get on their feet, and then the home would adopt them out, and the people would go back and their kids were gone. That happened in this particular place. But, so I don't know, because her dad didn't die until she was 15. But he died of tuberculosis, so I don't know if he was sick, he couldn't take care of it, I don't know. But she was in a home and was taken by a family also. They weren't family though. She didn't really know anything about her family until she was about 20. And her siblings, her older brothers who were like 12 when she was born, or 2, she was adopted out to Maine. They weren't really adopted. They were just taken, and they were going to work. My grandmother's listed as a servant in the next census when she's 10. But her sister was taken to Maine. Well, that's who the cousin comes through, is her sister that was born, that went to Maine. she didn't know a lot about her family, and so on her marriage record, it says she was born in Maine. She wasn't born in Maine. She was born in Boston, but that's what her record says. That's where she got married. And so the cousin was writing me and saying, how is my family related to yours? Because I know, Schofield, which is my grandmother's married name. So I explained it all to her. I said they were sisters, and she's never changed the information on Ancestry. It still shows her mother as being born in Boston into some James Murphy and Annie born in Maine that aren't really her parents. But, what can you do? You have to give them the information they have. But it's just interesting that, people need to know all those things. But one of the evidences I gave her was the address. I said, this is your mother's birth certificate. She was born into this family in Maine at this address. Her brother was born 2 years earlier at the same address. This is her family. Still no change, but you know. Okay, so I just want to close kind of talking about census records in general. I have some friends who are like, oh, census records are never accurate. I love census records. So what are the pros of a census record and what are the cons? Putting families together, to me, is such a big thing. That is the best and greatest thing a census record does. It puts a family together. It shows your relationship. Maybe there is a cousin in the family. Like I said, there's a cousin in the 1950 census with the name of O'Brien that I know is family, but I don't know her family. I've seen another O'Brien in another census record. This was a girl. The boy was Sylvester, which is my grandmother's brother's name. So it might be a grandfather's name with the Irish name. It puts them in a location. Like I said, to identify someone, you need a name, place, date, relationship. A census can give clues to all of that. That doesn't mean you accept it as the gospel truth and there's nothing, it can't be true because it wasn't the way. My mother-in-law is funny. I showed her a census record. She goes, it can't be it. He never went by that name. And I'm like, has all 5 of his siblings, has the parents, has the location. Maybe he went by that name for a year or two in that time that you don't know. So just be open to that. Be flexible, because there might be some information you don't know in a census. What are the cons? I really think most census takers make guesses. I was indexing some once, and they were like Oriental names. Oh my gosh. I know they didn't ask how to spell those names. I pity the people trying to do research on that. I read through some of the instructions for the enumerator in the 1950 census. So for example, when they wrote race, they were not supposed to ask what the race was. Mm-hmm. So if someone kind of looked Chinese, they'd write Chinese. If they kind of looked black, they'd write, black. And so they might have used Negro as a word in that time, but they weren't supposed to ask, which I find really interesting. Now, I'm sure, how many of you have ever found that your relative was not completely honest in an age or something on a record? I found them. Mm-hmm. Maybe because they were too young and they didn't want to look too young, or maybe they, you just don't know. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, like this sister of my grandmother, she just didn't know. She was adopted out before she knew things, and she just said, oh, I must have been born in Maine. And that's why it's wrong. Misspellings, are common. And sometimes you're not sure who provided the information. Was it, the 12-year-old sister that gave the information? Was it the father? You know, it's going to be, the mother would be better. You know that, you know. Sorry, men. I know when I was growing up, my dad, when I'd go to the doctors, when he would say, "What's your birthday?" I'm like, "Don't you know when I was born?" But, just remember those things. Take them with a grain of salt. But census records can be very informative for most things. If you haven't looked at the 1950 census, take a minute, take a little bit of time to start going through people you know and see if you learn anything new. That's all.
Thank you.